Where did the world and everything in it come from? How does the world function? How is it maintained? These are fundamental questions for the modern scientists, and around the world, scientists continue to ask these fundamental questions. Well, what about the Middle Ages? How did medievals try to answer these questions? Well, if we go on the basis of sort of hearsay and modern prejudices against the Middle Ages, and the modern conception of the bad relationship between science and religion, we might come back with the glib response, well, the medievals were deeply religious. Bible says that God created the world. That's the end of the question, end of discussion. Well, such an answer may well have satisfied, probably did satisfy, a great number of medieval peasants. And it probably satisfies some modern fundamentalists as well, but it does not satisfy very much otherwise. Certainly medieval intellectuals did not find the answer, God did it, to be an adequate answer. The medieval theologians wanted better answers. So in this lecture, we're going to examine the science of creation. This will allow us to examine several interrelated issues. First, in what context natural philosophy was done, namely, in a theological context. Don't lose sight of the fact that natural philosophy is that handmaiden to theology. We'll also illustrate more about the relationships, the real relationships between science or natural philosophy and religion in the Middle Ages. But that last statement actually bothers me a little bit because it incorporates some anachronistic elements. Nowadays, we have a very clear idea of the distinction between science and religion. The medievals did not share a recognition of that distinction. In fact, in the Middle Ages, natural philosophers and theologians were frequently the same people. Well, one important locus for the natural philosophical inquiry about creation was the opening chapters of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 describes God's creation of the world. Therefore, it's a logical place to ground the study of physics, astronomy, earth sciences, matter theory, botany, zoology, meteorology, all the other branches of natural philosophy. Remember that the medieval method of study is by commentary. Well, if you want a place to write a general natural philosophical text, what better place to start with, to start commenting upon, than Genesis 1. Now, many treatises on the 6 days of creation were written, and this genre was known as hexameral treatises, or hexamera. Comes from two Greek words which mean the 6 days of creation. In some cases, particularly in the later cases, it's clear that the authors were actually much more interested in the natural philosophy than they were in biblical exegesis. In some cases, the biblical commentary format is more just a framework around which or in which to build a natural philosophical system. Well, let's go back to the early days of Christianity to start with commentaries on Genesis. The patristic writers began the hexameral tradition, particularly two of them. One, St. Basil, who was born around 329, died in 379, and the other is St. Augustine, one in the Greek world, one in the Latin world. Basil the Greek, Augustine the Latin. Now, St. Basil's commentary was given in the form of homilies. And these homilies were given largely to audiences of tradesmen. So he's doing something very important there. He's relating God's creative handiwork to the kind of crafts that were engaged in by laborers. It's a way that St. Basil, in fact, elevates the status of the craftsman by comparing it to God's own creative activity. But the important thing about Basil's commentary is that God is working at creating the world. Things that happen in Genesis are described as the action of God working upon his creation, putting his creation together piece by piece. He's a direct cause. Now, Basil's intention, his motivation, is to be homiletic and devotional, not natural philosophical, even though his homilies do contain evidence that he knew the Greek natural philosophical tradition quite well. He brings it in to help expound the text. In general, St. Augustine's more influential, certainly in the Latin West, than St. Basil. And St. Augustine set the tone for much of the later hexameral literature in his literal commentary on Genesis, something we've already talked about. Let me just remind you what Augustine suggested, what Augustine set down as rules for biblical interpretation. He says that they have to be logical, they have to explain the expressions that are used in the text, and our interpretations, most importantly, must be in accord with the currently received state of scientific natural philosophical knowledge. Now, for example, St. Augustine rejected the notion of 6 natural days of creation in favor of an instantaneous creation where God created everything in a moment, but over time, once God created time along with creation, these seeds that he implanted in the world, not literal seeds, but philosophical, metaphorical seeds, would develop over time into different shapes and different forms of different things under the influence of local conditions or to fit with local conditions. So instantaneous creation, creation develops over time as what is created in potential becomes actualized over time. Now, let's move from the patristic period, the foundations, to the Middle Ages. Key to examples of medieval hexameral literature is naturalism. Now, what is naturalism? It means basically that arbitrary, miraculous actions of God are not acceptable explanations for natural philosophy. And this is something that I have to impress upon everyone, that this is a place where moderns don't necessarily have the same view as the medievals. The medievals were very clear on this. God, yes, could do anything, but just because he could do something doesn't mean that using his omnipotence was legitimate as an explanation, as an answer to questions. Now, this view of naturalism is often explained by the notion of primary and secondary causes. Medievals would all agree God is the ultimate primary cause of everything, but that fact has very little explanatory power. In fact, medieval theologians viewed an unnecessary recourse to the primary cause, that is to God, as what we would call in modern parlance a cop-out. Secondary causation, that is, the action of natural forces, which were created by God, were adequate and proper explanations. And these were the places where inquiry was directed. This was the focus of the inquiry, to look at these secondary causes. In other words, God creates a nature, and then natural forces that he creates in that nature have their subsequent effects. Now, medieval theologians held that God almost always works through secondary causes and within the framework of the nature he created. God's direct intervention in the world produces miracles, and miracles are very rare. I'll give you an example. Eclipses. Eclipses happen when the moon passes between the Earth and the sun. So we can explain that naturally. We don't need a recourse to God. Why are there eclipses? Because God made the world in such a way that there are eclipses. God makes eclipses. That's not an answer. However, even though we can say all eclipses occur naturally, there's one eclipse that didn't occur naturally, and that's the eclipse that happens at the crucifixion, because it happens not during a new moon but a full moon. So there's no natural way that there could have been a solar eclipse. So there's an example where God intervenes miraculously, overturns the usual order of nature, and acts contrary to nature to produce an eclipse at the wrong phase of the moon. Already in the Middle Ages, some theologians were trying to explain even miraculous events using natural causation. For example, the parting of the Red Sea. The Bible says that God sent a wind that swept the waters. Therefore, it's not God's willing that suddenly makes the Red Sea part in front of the Israelites. He uses a secondary cause. He uses part of his own creation, that wind, to cause the waters to separate. Thus, while man could never, under any circumstances, comprehend that miraculous instant of the creatio ex nihilo, the creation from nothing, everything after that initial moment should be explicable on the basis of secondary causation, with the exception of those unusual, contrary to nature miracles. Now, this approach, I think, bespeaks a real confidence in the power of human reason and inquiry to understand a rational, orderly world. And it presumably stems from Christianized Platonism that emphasized the power of the human intellect and the salvific value, the salvific nature of knowledge. There's a lot that Plato has to say, or Neoplatonists, particularly in the 12th century, about man's ability to know things. Well, let's look at several medieval hexameral writers to illustrate these points and show the variety of interpretations that were possible and the way natural philosophy was used and extended in an expressly theological context. Let's go back first to the school of Chartres, to Thierry of Chartres and William of Conches, both around the middle of the 12th century. They both showed a keen interest in natural philosophy, the natural philosophy particularly of creation. Thierry of Chartres wrote a treatise on the works of the 6 days. That's how it's entitled. And the text works its way through Genesis 1, verse by verse, and each verse of the Bible gives him one chapter in his commentary. But he's clear from the very beginning he's going to expound the text secundum physicam, according to nature, according to physics. He begins by positing the primary cause. Remember Aristotle, 4 causes to everything, even though the most of the Aristotelian writings were not known in the Latin West at this point. That part was known through digests. So Thierry of Chartres posits the causes of the world. God the Father is the efficient cause, the creator. God the Son is the formal cause. We'll come back to talk about that in a minute. The final cause is God the Holy Spirit, and the material cause are the 4 elements which are created by God in the beginning. Now, using the second person of the Trinity, the Son, the Word, as the formal cause, reveals his Christianized Platonism. What he's really doing is he's rewriting the Timaeus in Christian terms. In the Timaeus, the demiurge, the creator God, looks at the forms and forms matter. In this Christian view, God the Father, the Creator, creates the world through the Son, the Word through whom all things were made. So what he's really done here is to combine the Timaeus with Genesis. But these references to direct divine causation nearly disappear after the first few pages, and the rest of creation unfolds using his word naturaliter, naturally. Let's look at an example. At one point in Genesis, God separates the waters. He separates the waters below the heavens from the waters above the heavens, collects the waters into a basin so that the dry land appears. Well, how does Thierry of Chartres talk about this? Well, he uses natural causes to make this separation occur. The heat of the stars, the celestial fire, warms the waters on the face of the earth and causes them to evaporate. The vapors rise into the form of clouds. Thus, there is a separation of the waters from the ocean to the clouds. Now, this actually comes out of St. Basil. St. Basil says a similar thing about the separation of the water, but Thierry of Chartres goes further. He says the dry land appears because, first of all, the water of the seas is being evaporated, so there's less of it on the land, on the water, and there's less water on the earth, and so the dry land appears naturally, not through another intervention of God's hand, but through the action of the drying up of the seas under the influence of the heat of the celestial fires. So again, a natural explanation. Now let's move to William of Conches, Terry's contemporary. He goes much further. In fact, when you read the Dragmaticon Philosophiae, which I've already looked at a little bit, it's at first not recognizable at all as part of hexameral literature. There are almost no biblical quotations. There is no explicit exegesis of the Genesis text, like in Terry of Chartres' text. But if we look very carefully, remember that it's a dialogue between a duke and a philosopher, and their discussion extends over 6 days. The book is broken up into 6 books, 6 days, and each day is devoted to the kinds of natural philosophical issues that are brought forth by each day of creation in Genesis. So it's sort of, in a sense, a hidden piece of hexameral literature. I'm sure that the medievals immediately recognized it. For us, it's a little bit harder to see. At the beginning, God creates a chaos that is a mixture of 4 elements. The 4 elements totally mixed together chaotically in the beginning. Then, as soon as they are created, they have a nature, they have a natural motion, and they start to move, they start to sort themselves out, and the world starts to approach its current form by natural forces. Now, let's go back to this issue of the separation of the waters, and let's see what William does with this. This is actually very interesting. He first of all adopts the idea that the waters above the heavens in the Scripture are the clouds, the vapors of the clouds, produced by the action of celestial heat on the water. But he also adds something from experience, from common everyday experience. He says if we go to take a bath, and you take a hot bath, as the fire warms the water, you'll actually see the water being divided into a fine mist and rising up above the bath. This, for him, is analogous to what happens at the beginning in the separation of the waters. The fire is the fire of the stars and the sun, separating the waters. Now, at this point, the Duke retorts that, wait a minute, no, the Venerable Bede, an English writer, says that the waters are actually above the actual heavens, that is, beyond the sphere of Saturn, beyond the fixed stars. That's where they are, that they're frozen into ice, and that ice is then frozen into crystal. So they're hard. Are you going to disagree with this venerable father, says the Duke. Well, William says, yes, I am actually going to disagree with him, although I honor him in terms of what he has to say about the faith. We should be free to disagree with the theologians, with the previous writers, in terms of natural philosophy. Well, they continue their discussion. The Duke says if the waters are frozen and hard, they could support themselves like an arch. William says, no, that's not possible. The natural motion would be for them to collapse down onto the earth. We don't see that happening. There's no water above, literally above the heavens. William says, in fact, look, if you take a piece of ice and you put it in the fire, it dissolves and vanishes. This icy crystalline water up there near the fixed stars, near fiery spheres, would itself be melted and dissolved. It would not be stable. Well, then the Duke exclaims, seemingly in a bit of frustration, you attribute everything to the quality of things and nothing to the Creator. Surely the Creator was able to place the waters there, freeze them, and keep them suspended contrary to nature. And then William replies, what is more foolish than to assume that something exists simply because the Creator can make it? Whoever says God makes anything contrary to nature should either see that it is so with his own eyes, or show the reason for it being thus, or let him demonstrate the advantage of it being so. So this is a very interesting thing. This is a constant argument that we'll see between science and religion, for example, throughout subsequent history down to our present day. What do we attribute to God's power? What do we attribute to secondary causation? William goes even further. He says that life itself arose from the natural action of heat on mud, and even man originated thus from primordial mud, even though God at some point intervenes and gives him a rational and immortal soul. In fact, William says in a particularly interesting segment, that means that since man's body came about by the natural action of natural elements working on one another within the course of nature, several species of man could have developed. In fact, those natural actions are still at work today, and so even now, long after the creation, 6,000 years after the creation, a new species of man might arise spontaneously as a result of natural forces. Now, William says, well, in fact, seems possible, but we've never seen it happen. There's never been an example of another human being coming up out of the mud. It's the one that is not heir to Adam. So perhaps God wills against this. And then William says that natural causation is constantly acting, and it is uniform, and it is constant, but it requires God's willing it to continue, God's willing it, God's permission to carry on. So God isn't intervening exactly, but in a sense he's underwriting the laws of nature by maintaining them. This becomes a difficult theological point eventually about where God's action in underwriting natural laws comes in. And I don't have time to talk about it today, though. But what's important to take from these Chartrians is their insistence upon naturalism, that explanations in natural philosophy have to come about in a natural way, using natural forces. And moreover, we see these hexameral treatises as places where natural philosophy, speculative natural philosophy, can be advanced. Well, let's look at another character. This character is a little bit later, Robert Grosseteste, last name meaning big head. He was the Bishop of Lincoln. He was born about 1168, died in 1253. He also promoted what is more or less Platonic reading of Genesis, but he was particularly interested in one thing. That is light. Now remember at the beginning of Genesis, what is the first creation? The first creation is light. Fiat lux, let there be light. That is how God begins creating the world. Well, light is also a key aspect of Neoplatonic thought. For Neoplatonists, before Christianity, in fact, or outside of Christianity, the world is created by an emanation from a self-contained, self-sufficient, single God. He radiates his goodness, essentially, like light, and that emanation creates the world. Well, this Neoplatonic idea was Christianized in various ways throughout the Middle Ages, very important Neoplatonic thought. We even see it, the emphasis on light, in the building of Gothic cathedrals, which are so interested in making these huge windows to let in light. To let in light. And Robert Grosseteste, his natural philosophical ideas are connected with this. For him, light is a vehicle of creation. It is a vehicle of knowledge. We get knowledge by light, by illumination. We still use that word. Now, Grosseteste likewise favors an instant of creation. The 6 days are just rhetorical, he says. They express 6 parallel ways of expressing the creation, but it's not actually 6 literal 24-hour days. For Grosseteste, the way God creates the world is this. He creates a dimensionless point of matter, and a dimensionless point of light superimposed upon it. Now, why dimensionless? Well, Augustine had realized that time is itself a creation. People who ask, what was God doing before the creation, are being silly, because there is no before the creation. Time comes into existence only when there's something outside of God. So God has to create time. Grosseteste takes it another step and says, well, the dimensions don't exist. Space doesn't exist before God creates them. God has to create the three dimensions. And so Grosseteste says that God creates a dimensionless point of matter, a dimensionless point of light superimposed on it. And that's all God does, essentially. Because what is the nature of light? Light naturally radiates out from its source. So the moment that was created, the light radiated in a spherical way, carrying the matter with it. It kept radiating instantaneously, actually. The propagation of light for Grosseteste is instantaneous, until it becomes so diffused that it stops radiating. Now, Grosseteste was aware of something akin to our inverse square law for radiation, that the power of the radiation drops off with the square of the distance. So at that point it stops and the spherical cosmos is created. He then elaborates further how the rest of the celestial spheres are generated, but that's the moment of creation through the expansion of light. Now, interestingly enough, Grosseteste's interest in light manifested itself in studies of optical phenomena. He wasn't necessarily interested primarily in learning about the laws of refraction and reflection. He did, but that wasn't the particular interest. He wanted to know about light as a vehicle of knowledge, a vehicle of God's creative activities. Grosseteste is often celebrated for being experimental, and it's certain that he did do certain experiments to look at light. He studied the rainbow, he studied refraction and reflection, but again, we have to keep this in a theological context. I'm only going to mention one other character, and that is Henry of Langenstein. Henry of Langenstein comes from the next century. He dies in 1397, so he's a 14th century character now. He wrote a lengthy commentary on Genesis, which turns out to be a veritable compendium of 14th century natural philosophy. Now, given his later dates, Henry is predominantly Aristotelian, not Platonic, but he draws on a huge variety of sources. And in fact, it's as if he's writing something in the encyclopedic tradition, because he talks about just about everything. Physics, cosmology, all the things that you could possibly pull out of the first chapter of Genesis. Lots of references to all kinds of natural philosophical writings. So we see a context now in which natural philosophy is done. Natural philosophy, what we call more or less science, the study of the natural world is a better way to express it, being done here in a theological context. New knowledge, even experimental knowledge in the case of Grosseteste, arguments from common experience in the case of William of Conches, being used to further the study of the natural world. In all these cases, what we're seeing is the open border between scientific and theological speculation. Theology and Scripture do not restrict natural philosophy, but instead often provide an impetus and a locus for natural philosophical speculations. Well, in the next lecture, we're going to visit two new orders, two religious orders that developed in the 13th century, the so-called mendicant orders, namely the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Now, interestingly enough, the Dominicans and the Franciscans soon became deeply involved with natural philosophical issues, and curiously enough, their natural philosophical thought was unique to each order and differed between them.